some of you are might be familiar with my show might ask themselves, why am I doing a presentation on the Baroque? I'm actually working with Italian innovators on the late 19th century and early 20th century. So why the Baroque? Well, first of all, this is actually the moment in which the Baroque was actually rediscovered. And this was the moment in which modernism felt a great affinity, a great familiarity with the Baroque as a laboratory, as an experimental laboratory of new solutions. Not necessarily organic, often contradictory, but certainly a very, very creative laboratory of innovative solutions. And as we'll see, actually our modern world owes a lot to the 17th century, despite its being normally associated, the word Baroque is normally associated to the words grotesque, the word deformed, the word irrational. Well, during the period that is the focus of my research in the late 19th century, the first to rediscover the Baroque as a force, or rather as a Dionysian force, was actually Nietzsche, who opposed the idea of the Apollinian, the classical harmonic model of art, to this idea of the Baroque as a Dionysian force, as an irrational force that contains a lot of creative impulse. This was like in the Birth of the Greek Tragedy, his kind of first philological work on the Greek tragedy. And one of the colleagues of Nietzsche, Heinrich Wölfflin, would then define the character of this force as really an energy that deforms the harmonic structure of a circle. I'm sure you've seen the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo, the perfect man circumscribed in a circle, and deforms this energy deforms this circle, making it like an ellipse. Now, with regard to Italy, and this is kind of the object of our conversation today, I want to start from the two authors that are normally associated with the Baroque, who are Bernini and Caravaggio. Bernini and Caravaggio were real, especially Bernini was really the superstar of his time. But after the 17th century, after his death, he was quickly forgotten. The author that after 2 centuries, almost 2 centuries, that rediscovers Bernini is actually Gabriele D'Annunzio in Il Piacere, Pleasure, his 1889 novel, where Andrea Sperelli actually the protagonist walks through the streets of Rome and finds the monuments that were left by Bernini. And Caravaggio was discovered later in the 1920s by Roberto Longhi, the critic. So today, we will talk about the Italian Baroque as a laboratory of experimentation, as a century that really wants to digest immense changes and re-elaborate these changes in new forms. So there is like an element of challenge in the Baroque of deforming a previous reality as a way to reform it, where reform is not just like a reformation, but also the design of innovative solutions. And in this sense, the procedure, the way to operate of the Baroque is very similar to the way that designers have in creating something original. So the deformation of a pearl, this is a pearl, which in Spanish is called barroco, like a seemingly perfect pearl, but it's actually a very deformed pearl. The act of deforming as a way to recreate. There's an element of play in the design of new forms. We'll talk also about the Baroque as a multimedia platform. So an aesthetic idea, an overarching aesthetics, which aims at merging and really overflowing one art into the other. This is a pretty typical Italian way of operating. You might recognize it from the Renaissance, which is a similar aesthetics where, one idea is applied to different fields, different spheres. And it applies to the Baroque, but it will later apply to Futurism, which paradoxically will rediscover the Baroque not as a degenerate art or a poor art, but rather as a laboratory, an energetic laboratory of new solutions. So design as well is this form that creates an aesthetics that is applicable to many different spheres. If you think of a brand like Campari, Campari operates on the drink as a theme and applies it to architecture, design, photography, and cinema. So the application of one idea to many different spheres. And we'll see this how it unfolds during the Baroque. So we'll have like a brief overview of the 17th century as a way to figure out what incredible changes they have to re-elaborate in this new aesthetics, experimental aesthetics. We'll talk about this aesthetics as a multimedia platform, and we'll talk about the Baroque as a space, not just a mental space, but an architectural space. And we'll observe the case of Rome and its reconfiguration into a universal capital, so into the staging of this idea. Now, this is Europe in 1648, the end of the 30-Year War. These are some important facts that we need to keep into account when we deal with the 17th century. Well, the first is the 30-Year War. We just came out of a 20-year war, so we might have a sense of how long this might have been, how impactful this event might have been for the European consciousness. The century is also framed within kind of two dates, the Lepanto battle in 1571 and the siege of Vienna in 1683, when the Ottomans are really at the doors of Europe, and there's a coalition of states that really managed to preserve Vienna from being occupied by the Ottomans. So there is like this external danger. And again, once again, this is quite similar to our situation nowadays in our context. There is the first real revolution, and revolution is really one of the terms of the 17th century. It applies to politics, but mainly it applies to the planets. So the Glorious Revolution in England, which ends with the execution of the king. Then we have like the Revolt of Naples. It's one of the proto episodes of like the French Revolution. But at the same time, we also have like the Industrial Revolution, a phenomenon that is quite similar to our work, that brings a lot of changes in the production of objects, products, and services. We are in the middle of the fourth Industrial Revolution, which is the digital revolution, the internet revolution. So we might recognize a lot of these changes. This is the century of political absolutism with the court of France, Louis XIV, and the birth of the state as a bureaucracy. I invite you to consider all the absolutisms that are present in our age still. And this is also the age of the decline of the Spanish Empire. It's certainly the siglo de oro, the golden century, but at the same time, this wealth and this abundance is parallel to a sense, a perception of decay, of decadence. In the late 19th century, the metaphor of this co-presence of luxury, beauty, and decadence is Byzantium. And it's also the coincidence of two terms, Belle Époque, glorious age, and fin de siècle, end of the century. So this perception of the crisis, decline as something that is producing the end of something and starting the beginning of something else. This is also the time in which, in Italy, Rome is reconfigured as the capital of universal Catholicism. It's the time of the missions, and Rome needs to reconfigure itself as a universal capital. Venice is the capital of the publishing industry, especially after the 16th century work of Aldo Manuzio, and Milan and Naples move to Spanish rule. So this is the century that you might have known through the Promessi Sposi, the betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni. And this is also a century where we have a new global horizon. Once again, our world is a world that discovered this new global horizon. Every product is now within a global setting, no longer in a territorial one. And this global horizon is opened by missionaries, pretty much. So the explorers and missionaries. So France goes into Quebec with Champlain and the Jesuit martyrs. The Spaniards reach North America in San Agustin in Florida, where there's the first settlement in the United States. El Castillo is still one of the witnesses, the testimonies of this. And Spaniards actually entering North America through California, through the West. The British found Jamestown in 1607, then enter into Massachusetts and New England. It's quite interesting to see that in 1630 they found Boston, and in 1636 Harvard is founded. So 6 years after the settlement, they started university. So they had a great sense of the future there. It takes a lot of boldness to found a university 6 years after you reach a completely new land. The Dutch colonized New Amsterdam, New York City, Manhattan, but in South America we have Portugal and Spain that divide South America, and in Asia we have the presence of Jesuit missionaries in Japan and India, from Italy and Portugal, also China if you think about Matteo Ricci, and the presence of Spaniards in the Philippines. There's also an existential premise to deal with the 17th century, three actually. One, we need to observe really three immense shocks in the awareness of Western civilization. One is the discovery of the New World, so the perception that the world is actually much bigger than it seems. Try to imagine how you would feel if today someone told you, well, that there's a human or a presence on Mars. That would be mesmerizing and would require some time to be digested. The Copernican Revolution, which is the awareness that the Earth is no longer a perfect sphere and the Earth is no longer the center of the universe. What is scandalous, for example, in Galileo's observations of the moon, is the fact that Galileo discovers that the moon is not perfectly spheric. So the moon is subject to the rules of corruption. And in this sense, this implies that the sky, heavens, is not perfect. This really challenges an idea of kind of a teleological idea of the sky as this kingdom of God, where everything is perfect and not subject to the rules of time or corruptibility. And the third is the breaking of unity in Western Christianity through the Protestant Reformation. And again, the 30-year War has a lot of like religious dimension in it. The point of contention, the point of division is kind of contingent. But the protest in doctrinal terms is related to the nature of the Eucharist. So for Protestants, the Eucharist is a memory of an event, whereas for Catholics, Eucharist is the actual presence of the event of Christ, which is contemporary. So this will have a repercussion in art, as we will see. And these shocks explain why Andrea Pozzo, in the glorification of Saint Ignatius in the Church of Saint Ignatius in Rome, depicts a ceiling that is not just a ceiling that ends there, but a ceiling that opens up a new space. So the Baroque is this aesthetic that aims at opening up and discovering this space beyond what seems or seemed right before that moment. So how do we start conceptualizing the Baroque aesthetics? How do we negotiate this shock in aesthetic terms? So the Baroque is really this experimental, experiential, and multisensorial aesthetics that starts from a radical cut. So the idea that what we're living is a radical cut from what happened before us. Jürgen Habermas defines modernity, our modernity, as a radical break. Now, this cut is represented in the figure of David cutting the head of Goliath, which becomes one of the recurring themes. David and Goliath are also a theme that Roman Catholicism adopts to stage the victory of the little David against the giant Goliath identified with kind of Northern Europe Protestantism. The cut, once again, in Medusa, the cut which coincides with a point of no return. Medusa screams, and you might see this in Edward Munch, the scream, the perception that there is no return after these shocks. And Medusa is also from Caravaggio that we saw to Bernini, the perception of a cut that leaves us in a condition of scream. And the scream is also the theme of the Anima Dannata, the Cursed Soul by Bernini. And as you see, the statues are really lively. We'll talk about it in a second. The second element that we draw from these changes that the Baroque negotiates is the idea of the movement. Things are no longer static, but they move. They discover that it's the earth that is moving, that there's an energy that deforms things, that makes them move around. So in this sense, the expression of this is a torsion that we see in the David by Bernini. It is actually a self-portrait, but as a way to figure out how different this representation is from the Renaissance Apollinian representation. I want to show you the difference between the famous David by Michelangelo and the torsion of the David by Bernini. And this idea of the static statue or column and the tortile statue or the tortile column is moved from the statue to the architecture of the Baldacchino by Bernini in St. Peter's Square, where the tortile column expresses this idea of reality that contains an energy that deforms it continuously. We talked a little bit about the Copernican Revolution, and the ellipse is really the form that shapes the century. It's the form of the revolution of planets, and it's the form that we see in the domes of the churches or in the piazzas of Rome. So the idea of the ellipse as this new form that expresses the movement of things and expresses, as we were saying before, the deformation of a previous ideal that was seen as abstract into like an ideal that is expressing this force, the futurists called it dynamism of being. And lastly, the primacy of vision. So the primacy of optics, the telescopes, but also the primacy of seeing things and being seen, as expressed in the Narcissus by Caravaggio, and also as expressed in the metaphor of Medusa, who is the character that sees the instant, but is petrifying the instant. So Medusa is one of the key metaphors of actually photography. The idea that when we see the instant, when we see it happening, so Narcissus, the instant is petrified immediately. If we take like a selfie now, in 20 years, that selfie, which was born as a lively representation of our time emotion, will become a stone. Will become something that is immobilized, will no longer contain that livelihood. Now, I want to focus now on how this aesthetics applies to different fields, as we were saying, a multimedia language. And I want to start from Galileo. Galileo is actually a scientist, but also a great writer, a great prose writer, one of the inventors of Italian scientific prose. He was the son of a great musician, Vincenzo Galilei, and was involved also in the discussions that were parallel, all contemporary to this time with relation to the birth of opera. Now, Galileo is actually contemporary also to the unveiling of the Baldacchino in St. Peter's Square. So during the time of his trial in 1632, after the publication of the dialogue of the two chief word systems, in St. Peter's Square, the Baldacchino by Bernini is unveiled. We'll talk about it in a second. But I want to point this out because we normally tend to separate these realms into different compartments, but they are actually contemporary and happening in the same place. So we need to consider them from this historical perspective. Galileo breaks the relationship, the monolithic relation to faith and to authority. We'll talk about Aristotle as well, opening up a new space of knowledge. So science, scientia, means knowledge. And the knowledge that Galileo opens is the knowledge of the natural world. So when we talk about science, we talk about the division of scientia, so the knowledge, previous knowledge was like uniform, into two realms, the humanist kind of realm and the knowledge of the scientific world, which is reflected in the division Galileo establishes between kind of the language of God, the book of God in the Bible, and his operating mind. So the language of nature, the language of mathematics that needs to be addressed and known through a different method. In the same way, he challenges Aristotelism, so the ipse dixit, so the notion that we know something just because he said so, and challenges this through what he constructs as the scientific method, which is a method that is based upon experience, upon direct vision, upon direct experimentation and verification of a postulate. This primacy of vision and experience will be also seen in the contemporary art, as we'll see, for example, in Caravaggio, in the work of Caravaggio. It's kind of like late 16th century, early 17th century. Caravaggio is about the primacy of the senses, of the knowledge by way of the senses, of the five senses, as we see, for example, in The Boy with the Lute, that represents a painting that is not just appealing to sight, but rather to hearing, the smell of the flowers, the taste of the fruit that we see, the music that we hear. And in a way, the paintings by Caravaggio no longer stage a bidimensional image, but they stage an experience that we can taste. And this is something that, for example, if you think about like ads for scents or drinks, Campari, again, it's a great example, might make a lot of sense for us, because how do we perceive a scent through sight? We need to construct an image that is multisensorial, synesthetic, where different senses reproduce in us the experience of these drinks, even without trying them. The experience is also a carnal experience, as we see in Thomas, like putting his finger in the wound of Christ after the resurrection. So the idea of the flesh that we'll also see in Bernini, but the carnality of experience, the real experience that we see, for example, in the Madonna di Loreto in the Church of San Augustine in Rome, where the house of Mary is actually a house where the door has a crack. It's not like a perfect house, and where the pilgrims actually have the dirty feet. So the real experience, the real image of lived reality. The chiaroscuro is actually a construction that aims at staging through light something that is an event. So a painting that becomes an event in the way that we described as a theatrical event that happens right away. And in Caravaggio, there is also a lot of observation, vision, seen from the perspective of the scientific gaze, as we see in the Canestra and the Basket of Fruit, which is really a scientific representation of this object. Actually, still life painting is born in a scientific context, because it was the way in which scientific knowledge was divulgated, and it was like acquired a visual element. But this observation by Caravaggio is not just scientific, but is also a marveling observation, because like these objects that are reproduced in their likelihood are also symbolic concepts. The Basket of Fruit was commissioned by the Cardinal of Milan, Federico, as a Eucharistic representation of the beaten apple, the figs, the sin of Adam, and also the grapes as a symbol of the Eucharistic wine. And this is kind of a religious and secular representation that we find prolonged on the one hand in the Dinner Emos by Caravaggio, where once again we see the basket of fruit, which is represented scientifically, but also with this religious concept. But also in a secular way, where the basket of fruit here, in The Boy Carrying the Basket of Fruit, is replicated also in the two important paintings that Caravaggio dedicates to himself, the drunk Bacchus and the sick Bacchus, where the fruit becomes an emblem or a concept that expresses, on the one hand, the livelihood, the abundance, the ripeness of reality, once again, the basket of fruit, but also at the same time, the decay of reality. So fruit is actually that representation of the coincidence between the ripeness of time and the decay of time. So the fleetingness of a present that is already in crisis, but it's actually creating something new. And so this goes back to the duality of fin de siècle, belle époque. Now, in Bernini, how does this happen? It happens through the representation of a livelihood, a vitalism, which transforms the characters into psychological characters. So the livelihood of a statue is no longer static, but it's actually, and this is the portrait of Costanza Bonarelli, the lover of Bernini. It's one of the most incredible statues that you will ever see, where you see the moment of the woman observing the beloved, the hair that is moving, the lips that are waiting, the breath of the statue, and actually the tuft of hair that she didn't manage to comb. So the statue is no longer the site of an eternal identity that never changes. So the sky that is always fixed, but it's actually the representation of an eternity that is constantly fresh, constantly lively. We have an idea of eternity in connection to immobility. So the mountains might be a good metaphor for it, but eternity actually can be represented also through the ever freshness. So in this sense, a waterfall is eternally moving. The Baroque is about this. Movement, in fact, is really the place of a constant metamorphosis, and this is perfectly represented in the statue at the Galleria Borghese of Apollo and Daphne, where Daphne is chased by Apollo, and as a way to escape him, transforms into a tree and actually looks at us and calls us to become part of this theatrical moment. We're no longer outside. The statue, Daphne, calls us to help her. And we see the movement, the wind that moves the veil of the statue. And we see how the statue is something that requires to be not observed from the front, but actually we need to walk around it to see how this transformation takes place. And the statue might acquire very, very different forms, as we see here from this perspective. So the multi-perspectivism, as Nietzsche would call it, is the staging of sculpture as an event. We see this in the theater of the Ecstasies of Saint Teresa in Rome, Santa Maria della Vittoria, where the light, that is the actual light entering from the window, is prolonged by the light of the sculpture. So the overlapping of eternity and ephemeral there, and where this event generates the ripeness of a mystical, or if you want, erotic experience, this moment of peak of ripeness, of intensity, where everything is displayed. And this moment is actually not private, but is seen, so the primacy of vision, the primacy of acting, the theater, by the spectators that are on the sides of the chapel. Now, we see in this statue also the representation of the clothes, the fold, the veil, as moving clothes. Now, Leibniz, like a great philosopher of the 17th century, really talked about the fold, or the experience of the unfolding of the universe, something that we saw, for example, earlier with Andrea Pozzo, and the unfolding of the beyond the ceiling. And this idea of the fold is expressed, for example, in St. Peter's Basilica, in the tomb of Alexander VII, the great patron of Bernini, where the door, the representation of the death as a door, is represented through the idea of a veil that is unveiled or open, and this is kind of like a theater curtain in a way. The veil is also represented in funeral monuments that are no longer static. This is Santa Maria della Minerva, and we have like sort of Maria Raggi, that her funeral monument is constructed as a veil that is moving. And this is Beata Albertoni, the Blessed Albertoni, where once again the movement of the and the folds of the clothes express this double reality as fixed, eternal, but also in constant movement. And one of the ways in which this new movement, these new forms are created, this new knowledge is created, is through the tension of contrast, as we see in the masterpiece by Bernini, the Rape of Proserpina, where we have like the contrast of the feminine beauty and the masculine force, brutal force, where we have like the statue that once again asks us to participate in the drama and even cries, as we see in the tear of the statue. And where we see the tension between force and grace, or in this case, the flesh and marble. So this idea of opposing contrast is really a way to obtain in the reaction a new effect. And this is really one of the most incredible details of Baroque art. At the same time, during the same period, we also have this other development that is related to the figure of Claudio Monteverdi, who works in the court of the Gonzaga in Mantua, which is one of the great centers of the Italian Renaissance, but also one of the great centers still in the early 17th century. Now, near Mantua, there is a great industry that is developing, which is in Cremona, in the city of Cremona. It's the industry of the production of violins, the lute makers, Amati, Guarnieri, and Stradivari from the 16th century onward, really create a tradition of excellence in the production of violins. And this is still a tradition that is ongoing. In Cremona, there is the Museo del Violino, the Museum of Violins, that still celebrates this beginning. Now, this area of Cremona is also matched by this other production that takes place in Bergamo. Caravaggio is very close to the city of Bergamo, where this new industry is staged in painting, and Evaristo Baschenis is really the painter of still life works that describes this new industry, describes music, these new objects through sight. So we hear these instruments through the sight. And once again, these are 5 sensorial representations, like you see the velvet that appeals to tact. And again, Caravaggio himself, with the boy playing the lute, pays homage to this industry. Now, this industry and this tradition of painting backs the desire to create a new musical form in the Gonzaga courts. And this idea of creating a new musical form aims at mixing lyrics and music, and aims to do that around the myth of Orpheus, the poet singer who goes into Hades to save his wife, and is kind of condemned once he turns his back to Eurydice to look at her, and kind of gives into the temptation to look at her, and she returns to hell. But like this myth of Orpheus becomes the founding myth of opera, which is really the idea of recovering the Greek sung theater and bring it back to life in the same way as Orpheus does with Eurydice. And the first opera that is ever performed in Mantua is actually dedicated to Orpheus. It's the Orfeo in 1607. The antecedents are like the madrigals by Monteverdi, so the experimental texts that many of them are from Tasso himself, that Monteverdi tries to make happen through the means of music by overlapping text and music. And the Pastor Fido by Guarini, which is kind of a recovery of the pastoral drama. It's a very popular genre in the 16th century, which dates back to the Bucolics by Virgil. Now, the idea of opera is the idea of recovering the totality of experience. So we talked about Baroque as a platform combining different languages. Well, opera is this kind of synthesis of different languages, of theater, architecture, music, costumes, literature, all in the same event. So it's really a new language that is following like a multimedia strategy that overlaps text and music. For us, we are used to overlapping them, but this was not taken for granted at all. And this was not happening. So in this sense, opera invents this language, this new language of sung storytelling, which will become really a key feature of Italian society in the primacy of melodrama later on in 19th century, the 20th century, but also a key feature of the Italian mindset and psychology in a way, when we see the kind of the melodramatic social aspects of Italians. The idea of the contrast that we saw in Bernini, of the tension of opposites, is actually expressed in Monteverdi through the use of dissonance. So dissonance or contrast as a way to create, to make this creative Dionysian energy explode and generate new forms. Not all of them are well formed, but many of them generate other forms. This idea of the explosion that is born of the contrast is actually a key feature of futurism as well. In the last part of our conversation, I want to see how this idea of the Baroque is constructed as a space in the case of the city of Rome, which is really reconfigured as a universal capital. So these are the popes of the 17th century, and these are the two big artists that create Rome. Borromini, who was kind of like sponsored by Innocent X mainly, and Bernini, whose popes, sponsoring popes were Urban VIII and Alexander VII. He will sculpt their tombs in St. Peter. Before starting, I just want to give you a sense of the last names of these popes and the villas that these popes created and constructed in Rome. They're still visible. They're quite remarkable. So Medici, Villa Medici, Villa Borghese, which is kind of the site of the museum where you can find a lot of the works by Bernini and Caravaggio that I mentioned. Ludovisi, Gregory XV, this is Villa Ludovisi, Urban VIII, and this is Palazzo Barberini, where there's like the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art in Rome. Villa Pamphili, the villa of the family of Innocent X, Alexander VII, and the Palazzo Chigi, which is the residence of the Italian Prime Minister now, and Villa Rospigliosi. So the popes generate a new space through their family ties, but they also reinvent the cities around three piazza. Well, piazzas. One is Piazza Navona, built on top of a Roman amphitheater for naval battles for the Romans. Piazza del Popolo, which is really the center where three main avenues converge, Via del Corso, Via di Ripette, Via del Babuino, and St. Peter Square, of course. St. Peter Square was actually conceived as a closed square. It was open and conceived as a concept of an embrace of the church, embracing, extending itself beyond the facade and embracing the pilgrims. The facade of the church was built in the early 17th century, planned by Maderno for Paul V, Camillo Borghese. So that's the reason why you see Borghesius Paulus V on the facade. So all these popes wanted to have their names on these buildings. And this is the scheme of Rome from Piazza del Popolo, the three main alleys, and the connection with St. Peter Square. And all these piazzas and avenues are connected by a system of obelisks that are really the points of a network in the city of Rome that connects ideally all the main the main sites of the city. The kind of places where this network, this web of the city operate and becomes lively are fountains. Fountains as representations of the same coincidence of stone and marble and flesh, in the sense of stone and livelihood. So stone and fresh water, stone, eternity, immobility, fresh water, eternity as continuous livelihood. So the fountains stage this mix of eternity and contingence. And this is like La Barcaccia by Bernini in front of the Spanish Steps, shaped like a boat as a concept of the church. La Fontana del Tritone, fountain of the Triton fountain, near Palazzo Barberini, the palace of the family of Urban VIII, and the Barberinis, their symbol was the bee. So we'll see a lot of bees, and where you see bees, you see the person who commissioned the work of art. So this is the fountain of the four rivers, indicating that this global sense of the world through its main four rivers. We talked about the missions, and this is kind of the representation of Rome as a new universal capital. Then we see a lot of stairs, statues, and columns in the city that are constructed as participants of the theatrical space of the city. So this spatial network is actually inhabited. So the stairs require someone who moves in it dynamically. The statues, and these are the statues on Ponte Sant'Angelo, designed by Bernini, are in a way the inhabitants of the city. They are kind of the actors that play within this theatrical space. And this is immensely visible in St. Peter's Square, where the columns actually are prolonged into statues. So the columns become kind of spectators and actors at the same time of what is happening in the theater of the piazza. Now, with regard to the work of Bernini and Borromini, I want to show you some of the churches that express this idea. This is the St. Peter's Basilica. This is the Baldacchino by Bernini. We talked about it was coincident with the trial to Galileo. And this is an image that might give you a sense of how ugly it seemed and how horrible it seemed at the time, because like you have this moving tortile column that is right under the dome, perfectly shaped or harmonically shaped by designed by Michelangelo. So when it was unveiled, actually people thought about it as an avant-garde, as something that was ugly. Only now we see this tortile column, or these actually flourishing columns, as the expression of a vital energy that is constantly flourishing. This is a column that really gives a sense of like the contrast and the radical break that the Baroque wants to have with what happened before, the harmonious. And as you see, you have like the bees, so the Barberini. You see the staging of light, so the event in the glory behind the altar, the event of light that is continuous with the staging of the sculpture of light. In St. Peter's Square, we have also by Bernini the tomb of Alexander VII that we discussed, the tomb of his other patron, Urban VIII, the statue of Constantine as a like an apprenticing horse, different from the previous model of Marcus Aurelius that was like the kind of stable horse in a stable position, a position of power. And in the piazza, we see again the model of the ellipse, and this is the symbol of the revolution of planets, but also of the embrace of St. Peter's of the Church to the pilgrims. The same model is something that is replicated, and this is the blueprint of another church, St. Andrew at Quirinale, which is once again designed around the ellipse, and this is the dome of the church. Now with Borromini, we have like San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, which translates the idea of the moving facade, like a facade that is no longer static, but it's moving around through the idea of the serpentine line. So the curved line that constantly moves. And Borromini will play a lot with the effects of concavity and convexity, as we'll see. So this is the serpentine line. And inside, the idea of the irregularity of space, so the asymmetry of space, which generates new energy, as we're saying in the contrast of tensions. The contrasting tensions or asymmetry is what actually allows us to move, whereas in the harmony, there is a temptation to observe it in a dull way, in not really being involved in it. So this is once again the elliptical dome, and this is kind of the idea of the movement. You enter in a space that is moving around you. And I want to show you also Santivo alla Sapienza, this church that plays with the concavity of the facade and wants to have us enter more, don't be stuck at the bidimensionality of the facade. So the concavity and the spiraling, so the movement, constant movement upward that brings us up. And this is the interior of Sentivo alla Sapienza that I chose as my background, which is really an asymmetric structure that allows us to not go by default, but be transported by this vital energy to participate in it and actually become protagonists of it, in the same way as in the Futurist theater later on, Marinetti will ask the spectators to actually enter in the action and be part of it. And this is kind of the structure of the dome. And this is seen from the bottom. And again, you see the play of concavity and the serpentine line as a way to give this effect of movement. And lastly, the Sant'Agnese in Piazza Nuova, which is a church that Borromini designed for his patron Innocent X, where the facade is actually constructed again through this concavity that gives it depth, gives it like this extra layer of profundity, really. And this is the famous statue by Bernini in the Fontana, the Fountain of the Four Rivers, right in front of the facade of the church. Some say that it was like a provocation of Bernini staging a statue holding up the facade of the church designed by his rival Borromini, but they're actually built at two different times. So the Fontana of the Four Rivers was actually prior to the church, the edification of the facade. So with this, I really wanted to give you a sense of the Baroque as this complex laboratory of new forms and innovations. And I want to give you the connection of that time of crisis and difficult elaboration of the changes that were going on in connection to our own time, because we read the past to read our own present. So in this past, albeit contradictory, you might find it grotesque, you might find it perhaps ugly. There is, however, a movement of life that is not that is generating new forms, and certainly if we deal with the avant-gardes, the Baroque is something that we would call an avant-garde. We can see how the avant-gardes produce a lot of not so accomplished works, but also generate the innovative force to generate new works of art. For the moment, thank you very much and for being here, and I hope you enjoyed it.